Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's CATHETA webinar. We're coming to you live on March 6th. For anybody who's a CATHETA webinar first timer here today, our CATHETA webinars get their name from the Creek word for learning. And today you'll be learning about strategy and metrics for a successful annual grant plan from Diane Leonard. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. We're also thrilled that you could join us today. If you could follow along while I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here. So just a friendly reminder that the webinar materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. Anytime you log on to our new learning platform, if you need to access resources from this course or you want to look at some of our past webinars and recordings, you can find all of that in the courses section on this website. A friendly reminder, you do only have to register for the website just the one time. And then after that, anytime we are hosting a webinar, you'll just log in and you can join by clicking on that green banner that'll be at the top of your screen. We do ask that when you join, you select listen only. That way we can just kind of cut down on any audio feedback that might distract me or the instructor once they start. But if not a problem, then you can just come down to your mic device and mute yourself if you join unmuted. And then if you find that your sound is coming out of a different speaker than you would like it to, you can come down to the bottom of your screen and select that telephone icon, and you can select the proper speaker that you want to hear the sound coming out of. There are different ways to interact during the webinar. You can raise your hand. As I said before, this is where you can mute yourself if you accidentally joined unmuted. In the shared notes section, you'll find some helpful links. And then we do have the public chat available. So if you have any questions, any comments, if you're experiencing any kind of tech support issues, you could let us know inside of that public chat. I'll do my best to help you navigate through. And I have actually already put a link to today's presentation slides in the chat, but I'm going to put that in one more time just in case anyone can't see that. So that's available for download for you now in the chat. I would like everybody to go ahead and try the chat box out together if you wouldn't mind. You can let us know what your name is, where you're joining us from, your work or your role in Indian country that brought you to today's webinar, and your tribal affiliation. And then while y'all are introducing yourselves in the chat, I just have one final note. If you do click on this red menu panel that's all the way to the left-hand side of your screen, know that it does pull you out of the webinar itself, and it'll take you to whatever you select on there. It's no problem. You can just rejoin by clicking on that green banner, but I just want to give you the heads up. If you do click on it, it's going to yank you out of the webinar. So just be mindful of that. All right. It is with great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Diane Leonard. And Diane, I am going to make you presenter now and hand it off to you.
All right, thank you so much, Brooke. Thrilled to be with everyone today and to be talking about something that might seem a little high level given our previous conversations about grants, if you've been with me before in the different webinars we've been doing here. But we're going to be talking about strategy and metrics. And, well, despite our tech check, Brooke and I did a great job of testing and fixing some problems with my webcam.
Diane, just a heads up, if you're talking, we are not able to hear you at present.
All right, let's try again. Brooke? Yeah, okay, you can hear me now?
Still not having any sound. Folks, if you can just sit tight for a moment while Diane's mic gets sorted, we'll get started in just a few moments.
Okay, so Robert can hear me. If anyone can let me know if you can hear me chatting. My webcam is definitely not working despite our best tech checks. Okay, the other Diane can hear me too. Okay, so we're going to go without webcam today. You can just envision that I'm talking emphatically with my hands. I'm so glad, though, that the audio is working. Yeah, we're grant professionals, grant writers, nonprofit professionals. We just make it work, right? All right. So excellent. Glad everyone can hear me, regardless of whether you can see me or not. Um, Here's my smiling face in case you want to pretend that that's what I look like. Actually, that is what I look like today, minus the fancy hair, straight hair today. But a really fun update on the bio slide, and I think one that's worthy of highlighting, given that today we're talking about strategy and metrics. Can you guess which item on the screen is out of date? That's right. It is the one that has our total amount awarded for clients. I turned my slides into Brooke the other day, and what did we find out yesterday? That's right, a 5-year award for a client, $840,000 in amazing direct service support in their community. Those are the things that get me so excited each and every day. Now, dollar awarded, award percentage, yes, those are metrics we're going to talk about in a moment. My numbers, I'm never going to compare them to your numbers. And I hope that you don't compare your numbers to your peers' numbers just above or below you in the chat list. So when we're talking about metrics today, I'm impressed by anything and everything that you are doing for your community, and I will never want to compare what one person is doing to the other in terms of your metrics. What I always want to focus on is how it is that you are improving and strengthening and creating even greater impact in your tribal community. So just want to give that as a slight disclaimer as we think about our content for today. Speaking of content, on the screen now, you should see what it is that we will be covering in our conversation. We're going to talk about the many different metrics that we can use to define our success as it relates to grants. Today might look and feel a little bit different than some of the past webinars you may have attended with me. If you don't already have a notebook or a sheet of paper or a blank Word document or Google Doc open, I would encourage you to please do so. We're going to be doing some work together to help identify some of these metrics. So I'm going to want to have something that's handy for you to jot down your ideas as you're building your metrics. Then we'll be talking about how we use the data we will have gathered during our time together today to think about our goal setting for the upcoming year or quarter or 6 months, whatever it might be for the period of performance that you're thinking of. Yes, we'll always think about dollars awarded, but we're going to go beyond that as we think about our goal setting. Then we're going to take it away from air quotes, just us, the person doing the grant writing, to thinking about how and where our colleagues are going to help us achieve these goals. So that's our plan for today. Yes, I always have a Q&A at the end. Happy to answer any remaining questions when we get towards the bottom of the hour at our 90-minute mark. But I really love to see your questions in the moment. You can always put them right in the chat box. I have it front and center on my screen so that I will pause and answer as quickly as I'm able. Given the nature of what I'd like to do for our content today, especially this first section about defining our success, I welcome you, strongly encourage, although do not certainly require, that you are prepared to be in the chat box and sharing information. Not because, again, we're going to be judging each other's answers, but because your participation in the chat is going to help me understand as I ask different questions and prompts. That's going to help me understand when we're ready to move on to the next metric, or if there might be some questions. So that is my informal working agreement I would ask you to be a part of with me today. Do you have any questions about that ask? I'm usually not so emphatic about the chat, but again, today, I'm really hoping that you'll engage in the chat, even with simple Y for yes, N for no type responses, so that I know if we're ready to move on to the next metric. Could you give me an indication of either agreement or question about what I've asked in the chat box? Either yes, I agree, no, I don't, and I still have some questions. See what I'm doing here? I'm testing out the idea. I know, pretty transparent on my part for what it is that I'm doing. Excellent. Okay, I see a lot of you already responding. I'm not going to call you out by name if I don't see you in the chat box. I understand sometimes you might get pulled away. There's a phone call, an email, something is needed. But I'm really going to rely on you letting me know you're good to go in the chat as we move from one metric to the next. Wonderful. So we're going to think about success. And what does that look like beyond dollars awarded? I have, it might feel like a laundry list of items we're going to look at together today. But I'd like to hear your brainstorming first, or maybe the metrics you're already paying attention to. There's the dollar awarded. I called that out for my own bio slide, how the number just went up, and I was so excited. Those numbers, whatever they may be, always do indicate the impact our work is helping to create. No doubt about it. But there's a whole lot more to the story about our success and our impact than just the dollar amount. So could you please share with me in the chat box other metrics? Not, you don't have to give me the data, the number behind the metrics. I just want the definition, the description of the metrics that you are already using in your tribal organization that are beyond the total number of grant dollars awarded. I'm guessing that might take just a moment or two of typing in the chat box, but go ahead if you could please start sharing that information with me in the chat box. What else are you looking at as a tribal organization? It could be you look at it quarterly, it could be you look at it once a year, it could be you look at it every single week. That part isn't important for the frequency that you look at it, but what are other metrics you are looking at beyond the number of dollars awarded? Now, here's what's great. There is literally not a wrong answer to this question. Every single thing you type in here is awesome and is meaningful to you and your peers and trying to think about and defining your success and your impact. So, all right, Joseph, getting us started with number of individuals served. Love it. Great. Okay, so that's a good metric to think about the impact that the dollars you're securing are creating. Diane House says the number of meetings convened. Okay, Diane, I'm loving that. And I'm curious, I've got a follow-up question for you if you're willing. Number of meetings of grant team folks or number of, what types of meetings are you thinking about? I'm pretty certain that you're not just saying the number of meetings we hold as a tribal organization in 1 year. We don't want meetings for the sake of meetings. I feel confident from one Diane to the next that that's not what you meant. Perfect clarification. Strategy development meetings. Great. So I love that that's a metric you're considering because that's saying that you've got team members, colleagues, other members in the tribal organization who are committing time and effort to the conversation about grant seeking. Love that. Okay, good. Then let's see, we've got another metric from Joseph, diversified sources of funding. Yes, different types of grant makers, different types of programs, different types of fundraising support. Absolutely love where you're headed with that metric. And Mary has shared the number of programs that are operating. Okay, I like that. Thinking about if you're trying to grow the number of programs or services that you're offering, seeing that number increase is an indicator that you have found the funding to do just that, to increase the programs and services available. Mary, I was riffing a little bit on what you put there. If you've got any other clarifications you want to share, that would be great. I love the things that you've shared so far. If you've got any others that you want to share, by all means, please go ahead in the chat box and do so. We're going to be talking about my list here in just a moment. What is it that we think we could use as we consider our benchmarking ideas? When we look at this list, before I bring it up, it is, well, long. And the intention in the list I am about to show you is not that you as a tribal organization, should gather and track and manage and report on and have a dashboard for all of this data. Absolutely not the point. Rather, what I'm doing is showing you what you could measure, what you could use to define your current success. Each organization, this is a super broad statement about grant-seeking organizations of all shapes and sizes, not just about tribal organizations, but grant-seeking organizations define their success related to grants in different ways. And that's okay that it is not a cookie cutter list of definitions related to our success, related to the metrics we track. Different grant-seeking organizations have different strategies for what does it mean to not be dependent on grants? What does it mean to have a healthy relationships financially with grants? What does it mean to think about grant dollars in the organization? And often leadership and the way they think about finances and the way they think about grant strategy may influence this list. So with that, before I show you my list, we've got one more metric that is already being tracked by you as a group on the line today. Marla shared that the number of housing units available to tribal members is a metric that's being tracked. Great, that is absolutely about the impact of where are your grant dollars being spent, how are they being used, what does that look like in practice in your own community. Love it, Marla, thank you so much for sharing. So without further ado, I made a big deal about it. Here is the really long list of things that you could consider. As I said just moments before, there is zero pressure from me. There is zero requirement across the field of grant professionals, of grant writers, that you track and measure and report on and have a dashboard for this entire list. Absolutely not. What I'd like you to think about, we're going to walk through each of these. What do they mean? How might you track it? Maybe you already do have this information and you said, oh, I should have typed that into the chat box. As we think about each of these, I'd like you to find one. You can find more than one, but I would like you to find at least one that you think would be meaningful for your colleagues, that you think would be meaningful for your leaders to talk about. Do we want to measure this moving forward? Here's why I think it might be helpful. Okay, so you don't have to accept them all. You don't have to start tracking all of these, but pick one to talk about, to get confirmation from others that this is the one we want to add to what we are already tracking about our grant process and our grant success. This is one that you and your colleagues will agree, could agree, maybe you'd pick two, like I said, maybe more than one, but we think that this will help us to better define our success, to broaden our definition of success. Shall we look at the first? The award percentage. Now, please remember my statement earlier. We will not be comparing each other's numbers. Absolutely don't want to do it. Why? And I make a really big deal about it when we talk about award percentage. We do not, should not want to see you tracking your award percentage or any of these other metrics and comparing yourself to other grant-seeking organizations, because each organization has its own strategy. So for example, National Institute of Health, NIH, has one of the, up to this point, one of the lowest award rates for applicants. If you were in a grant-seeking organization that was almost exclusively previously seeking NIH funding, oh, you would not want to compare yourself to organizations that were not seeking NIH funding at all. That would not feel like a fair comparison. Because, well, it's not. Does anyone have an idea, or maybe you know, does anyone have an idea of what the overall award rate was for NIH the last time it was published? Given the big deal I've made out of it, certainly it's not 100%. Far from it. It might be rather a low number. If anyone wants to make a guess, share a guess in the chat, I'd love to hear. What do you think? What was that NIH award rate the last time it was published? There's no prize for guessing. I know. So you're like, Diane, why don't you just tell us? Sure. 13%. 13% of applications put forward to NIH were funded. That is an awful lot of rejection emails that were received. But people don't give up. They keep trying. So as you think about your award percentage, the reason I start with that NIH example is that depending on the types of grants, city, state, federal, private foundation, corporate foundation, family foundation, that you are seeking, you as an organization would very likely have a different award percentage than another grant seeking organization or another tribal organization that is doing different work, has a slightly nuanced, unique strategy. All right, so here's why I asked you to get your paper. I would like for you to write award percentage, or if you're doing this digitally, to please type award percentage. What I would like to hear from you in the chat box in a moment is not, what is your number? What I would like to hear from you in your chat box is, do you track your award percentage right now? Y for yes, N for no. Please go ahead and let me know in the chat box, not what the percentage is, but Y for yes, N for no. Do you currently track the percent of applications that you write in a year and how many get funded? Here's your part 2 portion of this question. For those of you that say yes, well, on your piece of paper, physical or digital, I want you to draw a box or make a line. And if you know your award percentage off the top of your head for this last calendar year, if you know that 2024 number, please put it in that box or type it on that line. If you do not know, if you said no in the chat box, what I want you to do, please draw a box on your paper or put a line in your digital file. You're going to be thinking about your 2025 metrics and put a question mark there. Do you want to track it or not? So what you're doing is you're going to end up with some visuals here that are going to build a dashboard for you. You're going to find out, what do you already track? What do you know? And for those where you're going to end up with question marks, you'll be thinking about, do I want to start tracking this or not? Would it be helpful or not? Now, Mary, I see that you said you do already track your award percentage. Fantastic. So for Mary and anyone else that already said yes, to the right of the box or to the right of the line that you made for 2024, please draw another one. And what you're going to be thinking about is you're going to have 2 columns, 2024, so most recent data, and 2025. What do we think we're going to achieve in 2025? Maybe you have already a number that is your aim for the year. Perhaps you're going to be thinking about, what do I want to do? Because what is this comparison about? Not about Mary versus me. No, it's about Mary versus Mary. I have 2 teenagers. One, well, about to not be a teenager anymore, about to hit her 20s. But since they were little, I have said, just worry about yourself, not other people. And that advice has played out countless times from the very first times on the playground all the way through, well, these different teenage years. And that statement to me is incredibly important as we talk about these metrics. We're not going to worry about other people and their metrics. We're just going to worry about ourselves and what it is that we can do as we think about what is it that we have achieved so far. What can we do to make it stronger and better? So if you're one of the folks who does currently track award percentage, whatever it may have been in 2024 is awesome because it represents that you got grant awards. What is it that you would like to do in terms of growing that in 2025? You're going to have to think about some strategies, some techniques, some tactics in order to grow it. It doesn't happen on its own, but let's think about what that growth number could be. We are on to our second metric. Now, please, on your piece of paper or in your digital document, I would ask that you please put percent funded versus ask. Percent funded versus asked. Let me describe what this metric means, and then I'm going to ask you if you track it or not. When we are looking at percent funded versus asked, what we are thinking about is what was funded by the grant maker. So we're only worried about those that were funded. Those that were denied, we're setting to the side right now. We're not going to worry about them. We're looking to find out what percent of our request amount is being funded versus what was asked. So said another way, we're trying to find out if we are getting fully funded for our request. So every time we ask for money, we're getting our full award, or are we getting partial funding? We're still grateful for partial funding, but if we're thinking about percent funded versus asked, or how much partial funding are we getting, maybe we find that on average, what's actually happening is we're getting 80% of our request in our award. We're not getting the full 100%. Maybe they're out of money. Maybe we didn't score high enough. There's a number of reasons that could happen. But percent funded versus asked is looking at, for those that you got grant awards for, what percent of your ask was awarded? Said another way again, what was the partial funding that you're getting? So this is cumulative over a year. Go ahead, please, in the chat box and let me know how many of you are tracking of the awards that you are receiving. What awards, what percent of awards are getting partial funding versus your full ask? Let me put a quick delineator there in the chat box so that our Y's and our N's don't get mixed up for our different metrics. How many of you are tracking your percent funded versus asked? Could you please let me know in the chat box? And if you've got any questions about this metric, as we go on, some of these metrics, they start to get a little unique. If you have any questions about them, all questions always welcome in the chat box. Your interaction does not have to be limited to the Y's and the N's. So are you tracking what percent is funded versus asked? Are you tracking overall what your funding looks like compared to your requests? What's happening with that partial funding? Oh, Mary, I like your framing there. Not yet. Okay, so you're considering it. This could be something for the future. So what I'd ask you to do is just like what you did for award percentage. If you are currently tracking this, maybe you know the number right off the top of your head, or maybe you can get to that in a spreadsheet on your server in just a moment. Please put that number or leave a space to put that number in for 2024. If you're not currently tracking it, you can put NA in your first section. For 2025, if you are not tracking it yet, you can draw yourself a little box or give yourself a line and put a question mark. Is this one of the metrics that will be meaningful to us? Here's why some organizations track this metric. If you find that, wow, 90% of our awards this last year were not fully funded, do the math to figure out what percent of the total asks were actually supported, but you found out the number of applications that were partially funded out of the whole, what might you focus on? What sort of feedback could I get from funders so that when we're making asks, we're getting closer to a full ask award, or we are always getting a full ask award? It might not be that you achieve 100%, because there are so many things outside of your control. How much money does the funder or the agency actually have? And so it is not all within our control, far from it. But if it's lower than you'd like, if it's not 100% and you really want 100%, every time we make a request, we get all of the money when we get an award, you can, again, start to ask for feedback from the grant makers to try and find out, why did we get partial funding? What could we have done to get a full award? Once you have a grant maker and you've got a relationship, a question like that can help unlock some great dollars without having to go through an entire new application with a brand new funder that doesn't know you yet. Well, that's metric option number 3. Let's talk about another one. Oh, that was 2. This is 3. Oh my. Okay. So our percent of funding renewed or increased. So you guessed it, on your paper or in your document, please write or type the percent of funding renewed or increased. What does this metric mean? This is looking at the funding. So now if we're looking backwards at 2024, we're looking in the rearview mirror. If we were to think about this metric for 2024, what we would really be saying is, of the funders we had in 2023, how many funders, or you could say how many dollars, either one will work, you could do both, how many funders that we had in 2023 either funded us at the same level in 2024 or increased our award for 2024. So you actually have to look at 2 years worth of data in order to think about this particular metric. Let me put a chat box delineator. How many of you are tracking this metric? Y for yes if you are, N for no if you're not. You could say interested if you're like, oh, I hadn't considered that, if you're one of the folks who's not tracking it yet. It takes a lot of effort to get a new grant. That was my technical term for it. A lot of effort. This metric is helping us to think about, what are we doing that's great? What are we doing that is enabling us to get renewals? What is enabling us to not just get a renewal, but to get an increase in how much funding we're getting? The funders you already have, the ones you're building relationships with, the ones that you're reporting to before the deadline, each and every time something is due, you have worked so hard to get those grants. Getting a new grant maker on board, frankly, costs you more. It's even more effort to bring someone new on board than the effort it takes to maintain someone that already knows you, that trusts you, that thinks you're a great grantee. It is worthy of celebrating the percent of funders or the overall percent of funding that you have that is renewed or increased year over year. You could really have some deep fun with this metric and think back, especially if you've got big multi-year grants, if you're constantly getting 3 or 5 year grants, not single year 12-month grants, you could do the metric in a slightly different way, because once you're in that multi-year period, right, it's more about grant compliance for why you'd get contract from year to year. But at a very high level, the place to start is As I mentioned, if you're thinking about your 2024 data, what percent you would use, you're going to look back, what did we have in 2023 that we've renewed and or increased from 23 to 24? It's so fun to look for images related to money and increases and try to keep showing different ways that by tracking these different metrics, what we're really always thinking about is how do we make these metrics stronger? How do we make it so that our efforts related to grants produce more revenue for our projects, our programs, for our tribal communities? This next metric, so now we're going to be up to 4 for the potential for what you might have on your scorecard. Again, you're not going to have to add all of these. When you're all done, I'm going to ask you to pick at least one that you want to focus on. What is the percent? I shouldn't say which. What is the percent of funding that is new? So this metric, just like the last one, is going to require us not to look only at 2024, but also at 2023. If we look at what we had in 2023, we had a list of different grants. And then if we look at what we have in 2024, we certainly are super excited about how many funders renewed with us, whether they increased or stayed the same. But what does it look like? You could say percent of funding that is new. You could say number of new grant makers. You've actually got a few options here for which way you want to present the data. But tracking, what is new? That is a bunch of effort to get these new awards, new relationships, new reviewers, new processes. How many of you, whether it's being tracked by percentage or it's being tracked by number of new funding relationships or it's being tracked by what? You tell me, but how many of you are tracking the new money, the new grant makers, the new awards that you're getting compared to what would have happened the year prior? Go ahead and let me know in the chat box so that I know that you're all still with me building your dashboards here. Y for yes, you are tracking funding that is new. No lets me know that you're not doing it yet, but it could be one you consider at the end of our dashboard building. So Y for yes, N for no. Are you tracking the percent of funding that is new or the number of funders that are new? As you are typing to me Y for yes, N for no, as a reminder, there is no judgment on what you are or are not tracking. Rather, it's an indicator for me that you're here, you're thinking about it, you're drawing out your dashboard on paper, you're typing these items out into your document so that you can have an idea to lead this conversation, facilitate it with your colleagues. What else besides dollar awarded do we want to use to define our success moving forward? All right, and so if you're playing along, it's going to end up looking a bit maybe like a bingo card, at least the way I'm drawing it on my paper. But so if you've got a 4th metric listed, you've written out percent of funding that is new, and it sounds like for many of you, you're going to have an NA for 2024 in your box or on your line. And 2025, your box or your line may have a question mark. You might consider it. You're waiting to decide because there are still multiple other metrics for us to consider. Speaking of those other metrics, let's talk about our percent of budget that is met. So on your paper, go ahead and write percent of budget, or in your document, please type it out, percent of budget met. This metric does not mean your entire organization budget, your entire tribal organizational operating budget for the year. That is not what this metric is looking at. This metric is looking at the way that you budget for grant revenue and what percent of your operating budget specific to grant revenue is achieved within the year. This is often one that the finance team, the accounting team loves to look at. But I don't want to assume that you feel the same way, that you have a strong love and affinity for this metric, or that you're paying attention to it in the same way that your finance colleagues might be. So I've put a delineator in the chat box. How many of you are paying attention to what percent of the grant revenue budget for the year is being met, is being achieved? Put your delineator there already in the chat box. If you could let me know why for yes and for no. Are you tracking what percent of your grant revenue budget has been met within the year? Of all the metrics that we will talk about today, this might be one of the fastest to calculate because accounting software can say budget amount, year-to-date actual, percent variance. And so you don't have to track a spreadsheet. You don't have to do any manual counting. You don't have to think about some great formula. Your accounting software can usually pop this out for you, and then you could put it into your dashboard. So is this a metric that any of you are tracking already? Please do let me know. Why for yes and for no. Of the metrics, as I mentioned, this is one that the accounting software can often help provide you with a few quick clicks. But because of exactly what I just said, it's the one that unless you happen to be a finance person that also has been given the grant hat, you get to write the grants and manage the money. Can happen, does happen. I'm not saying it couldn't, but usually this one means that you're going to talk with finance. You're going to ask them to provide it. It is not something that is right within your control. This is one when we're thinking about, well, it's true for organizations of all shapes and sizes, different operating budget sizes. I've sat on many nonprofit boards over the last 25 years, and this is the metric that board members, so like volunteer leaders for the organization, are most likely to pay attention to because it is front and center to them in monthly financials. So this is the one that of all, it's not the first one that grant professionals think about, but it's often the ones that volunteer or high-level senior leaders are thinking about. So it might not feel like the metric that you want to add, but we're going to talk about our colleagues here in a few minutes. It might be one that is of interest to them, or maybe they're already talking about, and maybe they would love to see it as part of your overall grant-related dashboard or your grant definition of success, not just a high-level, senior leader board type conversation. Our next metric, I have acknowledged how hard it is, how much work it takes to build new grantmaker relationships. Whether we're talking foundation, city, state, federal, it does not matter. Building new trustful relationships takes a lot of work. Having exchanges over email, at a conference, in person over coffee, over Zoom, whatever it might be, that takes a lot of time and effort. So what I'd love to have you jot down in your dashboard you're building is the number of new grantmaker relationships. We might have two more squares next to it, one for us to put in our number for 2024, and one for us to think about what would we want that metric to be? What is our ideal goal for 2025? So I've put the delineator in the chat box. How many of you could go back through your records or are already counting the number of grant makers that you talk to over the period of a year? Now, this is not about how many you apply to. but how many you talk to. And by talk, I'm super broad umbrella, right? I'm saying how many you have interaction with. How many grant makers do you have meaningful interaction with? You're going to get to define what relationship looks like in terms of meaningful. What does that interaction look like? But how many of you are tracking the number of grant makers that you are communicating with throughout the course of the year? Or could perhaps go back, maybe you've got a CRM system, a consumer, a client, constituent relationship management tool. How many of you could go back and track how many relationship interactions you have had? You might say, I guess I could probably, if I went back, I could count what? My number of emails or my number of scheduled phone calls. Like, what would I track? The CRM systems certainly make it easier to track. You can see which records you might have added activity to. So if you've got a grant maker record within your CRM, you would say, oh, I had a great conversation at a conference on this date. You add your notes about the conversation. Right? That would be one way that some organizations would track this metric. Others, if you know it's going to be a metric that it is important to you, keep a bit of a tally sheet, maybe a second tab in an Excel sheet if you're using that for a dashboard, somewhere where you can keep track. Oh, I talked to a grant maker this week. It was a brand new grant maker. I'm going to go ahead and count that in my tracking. So sometimes it's a bit more manual. The reason that I'm calling out new grant maker relationships, certainly you could do something similar with existing grant makers. The number of grant maker relationships you're managing, you could consider that as a metric as well. But if we're thinking about new grant maker relationships, that is an indicator that we are working to build our strategy, that we are thinking about if we want to get more grant revenue than we currently are. So I'd be really happy with either metric, the number of grant maker relationships that you're managing, or only the number of new grant maker relationships. If you go with the first way I just defined it, the number of grant maker relationships being maintained, being worked on, being stewarded, you would be including new within it. Or you can worry only about new. But relationships, if we think back to that grant lifecycle image that I've had on the screen so many times over the last 6 months here at the Native Learning Center, if you think about your grant seeking best practices, it goes grant readiness, grant research, grant relationships, then grant writing. And the reason that relationships are before, and I always point at them and I say, this should not be forgotten, this should not be shortchanged in service of a deadline. Relationships give you a competitive advantage. You learn things, you know things that other applicants wouldn't. Still more metrics. Can you believe it? Oh, I can. These are things that, depending on your organizational strategy, might be what is most important for you in the upcoming year or two. Our next one is about the number of collaborative grant applications. You can choose to write down either number of collaborative applications, or you could write down the number of new collaborative applications. Either would be fine. I'm highlighting it as new. When we're thinking about the number of collaborative grant applications, why are we tracking that? Why might we want to track it? Because grant makers have an increasing emphasis, and this is a generalization across all types of grant makers, but have an increasing emphasis on how are you collaborating? Who are you collaborating with? How are you not duplicating service and efforts? There's never enough money to go around for all the requests. So grant makers of all shapes and sizes, from foundation up through federal agencies, are looking for how do you collaborate and work together instead of duplicating effort. Slightly different question for you related to the chat. How many of you have been part of a collaborative application? Either you were the lead applicant or you were a part of, maybe a subcontractor as your tribal organization within an application? Why for yes and for no? Were you part of a collaborative application in this past year? So in 2024, was your tribal organization part of a collaborative grant application of any shape, of any size? Let's see. Okay, we've got a few yeses coming in. Being part of collaborative applications does not define your success as a whole for your grant seeking strategy. Sometimes the work you're doing lends itself more to collaborative applications. Sometimes it's the funding opportunities you're looking at that, well, frankly, mandate collaboration. The Office of Violence Against Women mandates collaboration. You must have a memorandum of understanding and agreement in place with at least one other collaborative partner in order to apply for multiple programs within their funding profile. But it depends on the type of work that you're trying to get funded with grants for what you'll encounter with your grant makers. And so again, depending on your strategy, you may or may not choose to add this to your dashboard, but I would like to have you list it so that you can either, like some of you said, yes, in 2024, you are part of a collaborative application. Maybe you're going to think about if it was new. Maybe you say, I'm not sure I care if it was new. They're a lot of work. I just want to count how many collaborative applications we were a part of. That's great. That'll go in the box for you after the new or existing collaborative applications. Put that under 2024. And then in your box or your line, your row to the right, you can think about what might that look like for 2025. So how many of you are in organizations that are actively right now receiving grant funding? You have at least one grant award that you are spending money for in your tribal organization. Can you let me know that in the chat box? Why for yes and for no? How many of you in your tribal organizations have at least one grant award? So you have at least a little bit of grant money, although maybe one is a lot of grant money, but you have at least one grant that you are currently spending money from, that you are implementing. Go ahead and let me know in the chat. Why for yes? We have at least one grant we're implementing. As long as you have at least one grant that's already been awarded, that you are spending down, that you are tracking, that you are reporting on, this metric could be for you. When we think about grant management, I just made a stressed face. See, my work is really focused on pre-award. What are all the things you have to do in order to get the grant award? And then I love to do a grant implementation kickoff meeting and hand off all our materials from 6 or 7 or 9 months ago. All right, time for implementation to happen. Time for grant management, the post-award stuff to happen. I'm dangerously knowledgeable related to grant compliance, but you won't see me implementing grant management services. Those are post-award. My team and I, we do pre-award. Are there any members of the National Grant Management Association here in the room today? Anybody? NGMA, National Grant Management Association? Mary, wonderful. They have their big annual conference coming up it's really soon, I think, really soon. But the National Grant Management Association is full of people who are doing post-award work. They're looking at what was awarded. Usually they're talking about big government grants, but grant management is just as important in foundation grants too. But what is required in order to manage, to report on, to keep the funding, and to stay compliant. So when we think about grant compliance, are you tracking any metrics related to your compliance? It might be. So on your score sheet, you can write grant compliance. And then what you can think about for 2024 to reflect back on it. Are we tracking what percent of our grant audits from a funding agency come back error-free, no audit findings? That might be something that you want to track as a tribal organization. That would be something to be incredibly proud of. Maybe what you're tracking isn't about a funder audit of your grant, of your accounting. Maybe what you're tracking is the percent of grant reports, programmatic and finance, that are submitted on the deadline or before. Maybe you're actually tracking what percent of your grant compliance reports, financial and or programmatic, that are submitted at least one day before. I love to talk about tracking of days before submission because that's an indicator of taking some of the stress out of the system. But how many of you, go ahead and let me know in the chat box, I've put a delineator in there, how many of you are tracking any metrics around grant management, around grant compliance? Maybe it's about, again, percent of audits from a funder that are error or finding free. Maybe it's about the percent of reports that are turned in on time or early. Maybe it's the percent of reports that do not generate follow-up questions from the grant maker. Go ahead and let me know in the chat box why for yes and for no if you are already tracking anything related to grant management or compliance. For some of you, you might say, oh, I understand what that is, but Diane, I'm like you. My work is all pre-award. Wonderful. So you might not feel strongly about tracking grant compliance data. However, and the reason I bring it up in this metrics conversation is we just talked a few slides ago about renewing and or maybe even increasing funding from current grant makers as one of the metrics that you might care about. What is something that the organization is doing as a whole that will influence the percent of funding that is renewed or increased? Yeah, you guessed it, grant compliance, grant management. So this might not be your immediate focus, but it absolutely might influence your other metrics you're looking at. So I'd encourage you to talk with others. Speaking of others, do you ask for any feedback from your colleagues? It's great if folks give unsolicited feedback. Oh, that was such a great process on that collaborative grant. Thank you so much for making that so easy for the rest of us. Or, wow, this is fantastic. This writing is so strong. You really captured what we want to do so beautifully. I'm guessing that y'all have had at least one, two, maybe a lot of very nice things said about your work. Colleagues tend to be pretty grateful about the grant writing work that's done, especially once it's been funded. Are you collecting? Are you keeping that positive feedback as a way to think about your success? Maybe how many unprompted pieces of feedback you get in 1 year. That's something you could track. Maybe you decide that actually, while these are internal stakeholders, maybe you want to treat them sort of like a consulting client, and you actually want to put out a survey related to satisfaction. I have seen colleagues do that. So how many of you are gathering comments and feedback, or maybe even formally asking for feedback around your peers' satisfaction with the work you're doing, the support you're giving related to grants? A quick delineator in the chat box. The fun part about this metric, if you're tracking it, is that then if you do get some nice written comments, I love to put them, actually I have a wall. You can't see it behind me when I've got my webcam on, but it's directly across from me. I can see it around my monitor. And on the top, it's got one of those big wall stickers and it says gratitude. And I print out emails, I put the handwritten note cards. I have, I guess, well, years at this point worth of those things. And like it's a few layers deep because I refuse to get rid of them. If I'm ever having a bad day, great place to go. But also is a good indicator of, all right, what does success look like? So I hope that you wrote that down on your scorecard that you're developing, thinking about if you want to add that to your list. Sometimes it feels a little uncomfortable because you're like, wait a second, I'm supposed to be keeping these? Like, so what? Did I humble brag? Well, and they pick you up on the dark days. But if you choose to formally survey, that can be some really nice 360 feedback too for your colleagues to understand about the work that you're doing. Program impact was, I think, the most common additional metric that you shared when we started this webinar. What is the impact that's being created through your work? I love that. That could be about, we saw about housing. It could be about number of classes offered, number of people supported, all of the metrics that you are using in the grant application. Yeah, you could argue that all of those are different metrics that you have a part in achieving. It's indirect for sure, but you are helping to generate that impact because you're helping to secure the dollars. And so I'm really happy that we saw so many of you talk about that in the chat box. You get partial ownership of those impact numbers, the outputs, the outcomes, the overall impact. Absolutely, that is something that you should carry with you with pride. And I loved that even though it was towards the end of my list, that so many of you already had that in your mind for what you're using for metrics for success. One last metric to consider: your professional skills. Whether you're thinking about the Grant Professional Certification Institute, that's the GPC after my name, or not, you don't have to be a GPC in order to get grant awards and in order to be incredibly successful. Far from it. But the thing I'm calling out about Gypsy is that the 9 competencies that they have give you the opportunity to think about, what are my strengths? What am I focusing on? How am I growing? I think that is worthy of celebrating as success to the rest of your team as well. Because it might be that you're focusing on, say, increasing skill and knowledge in the relationship building competency. Oh, we could see how as your skill grows in that competency, so do the number of new grantmaker relationships. So probably does the percent of funding that is new. So that skill building is a leading indicator for many of these other metrics. These other metrics might become lagging indicators. And thank you, Brooke has just put the link to the Grant Professional Certification Institute in the chat box if you want to learn more about those competencies. As you were jotting down these ideas today, thinking about which one, or maybe multiple, you would want to include, I want you to think about, what does that look like visually? How would you present it in some form of dashboard? Where I would encourage you to place it is within your existing tracking mechanism that you use for talking about what's pending or what's awarded. So sometimes it might be like you can see on this snippet on the screen, there's the percent of budget, there's the percent of requested. That was an organization that thought those were important metrics out of what I've outlined today. So you can build it right into the, here's what we've just submitted, here's what's pending, here's what's awarded normal report. But you could probably add just a little bit to make it a bigger dashboard that's showing more of the metrics that you think, or you and your colleagues think, are important. Now, I love a good Excel sheet, a good Google sheet for building my own dashboard. There are many embedded within different grant management tools. So I would encourage you to see if you have access to anything that already exists before you spend a lot of time building something. But simple is always the best. What is easiest, fastest to run and to present to folks, it does not require a lot of manual manipulation on your part. There are 2 tools that I wanted to tell you about that you can use. Now, I said, I don't want you comparing yourself to others. And that is absolutely true. This ROI calculator, so return on investment calculator, was created by 2 very good friends and colleagues of mine many years ago at this point. Danny Blitch and David Broussard created the ROI calculator. It still exists. You can put in your different variables. How much have you secured? Also, what are your costs? And you can think about the different mechanisms that they've laid out in order to show what your return on investment is. So you might say, wow, if I do this now, what if I do it again in 12 months? You could see if your ROI has changed. Sure, that would be even one more extra metric that you might consider. Maybe it feels like more of like a HR personnel metric, but your choice on whether you want to make that a big team metric or something very individualized, but a nice free tool for sure. And then a second free tool. Now, the word benchmarker makes you think that you're going to be comparing yourself to others. Yeah, it is. But I think it could be a healthy source for benchmarking. So Grant Station, many of you might know Grant Station as a research tool, or maybe you get a weekly update, usually on Thursdays. I got mine today from Grant Station about new funding opportunities that were coming out. But Grant Station has a free benchmarker that you can check out in their public resources portion of their website. So that is based on data that they have collected. Also, a shout out to Grant Station as one of the multiple partners that put together the annual State of Grant Seeking Survey. The benchmarker here, the State of Grant Seeking Survey results and big report every year. Yep, you're right. They are about comparing you to what's happening in the field. If you want to just stay in your lane and not worry about other people, don't go check out the tool. Don't go check out that report. But if you'd like to understand how you compare to others, and that you think that could be something that is healthy for your organization, I'd encourage you to check it out. All of that is free. If you're ever asked to take the State of Grant Seeking survey, if you see that on your LinkedIn or in your email, I strongly encourage you to participate. It's really been powerful data to show how much our work as grant professionals is evolving. So I'd strongly encourage you to participate in that survey when it opens. So, well, you may have just built a dashboard. You may have 2 or 3 new metrics you want to add. Now we need to think about how we're going to use them to set our goals moving forward. The way I've been talking about it, I've been talking about looking back on 2024, and here we are, it's already March 6th of 2025. You know, it's never the wrong time to set a new goal. If you're like, oh, I didn't have new goals set for our grant seeking on January 1st. No worries, today's a perfect day to do that. So how can we take what we just looked at for those metrics and set some goals for ourselves moving forward? I'd like to make sure that you spend some time looking at what you have for those previous outputs, the things you can count, the things that you think are important to measure. Every once in a while, I find myself getting a little lax on some of my administrative record keeping. I'm maybe not the only one, but well, I'm the one fessing up to it today. I'm like, oh, I have not entered this information into my grant management tool. I am now 3 weeks behind. Yikes! Better do that over Friday morning coffee. Because if I don't, I won't have really good data. I won't have clean data to use to think about my progress towards goals or to use the data to really think about, hey, what have we accomplished? So, you know, I'm just saying that out loud because in order to assess, you've got to make sure your data is up to date. I'm here for it. I've got the big cup of coffee ready to go tomorrow morning. That's actually on my to-do list. It's to make sure that all of our February data for applications submitted or that we heard responses on, awarded, or denied, to make sure all of that is properly entered in our record keeping. So if you want to do a virtual little coffee date with me tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, yep, that's what I'll be doing. Drop me an email. We can say hi. All right, what else do we have for the assessing of our previous outputs or measures? I have another free tool for you. This one's actually on my team's website. This is the GRASP tool. GRASP is really shorthand for a grant readiness assessment. And when we're thinking about this tool, it's actually not on a scale of 100. The image on the screen does show you a scale of 100, but if the blue lines on all 5 of these shapes on your screen were at the very, very edge of the shape, maximum score in the tool is actually 120. When we see someone score near, or actually we've had a few folks get 120, it's like alarm bells go off on our website, on our team server. Our team member that manages the tool is like, we just got a near perfect. Everybody stop. And you celebrate and you're like, wow. So don't feel pressure about these scores. Remember, you're not comparing yourself to others. I want you to think about what score you get. It takes about 10 minutes to take the tool. That's telling you about where are things now. And then I want you to think about what is it you might try to improve so that you could return to the tool in 6 months or in 9 months or in a year, and think about how did your actions to improve your grant seeking best practices and implementation of them, how did it improve your score? So we assess our previous outputs, our measures, or our in the moment numbers. GRASP is right in the moment. What are things looking like for you now? Then it's time to look around. What's happening? Change is inevitable. The field of grants is constantly changing. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about administrative changes at the government level for changes in priority in different agencies, or if we're talking about philanthropy adjusting to trends of what they're seeing in different communities. Change is inevitable in funding. So we can't assume that it's always the same. Before we set our goals, we need to look around us. What recently has changed? Is there any additional change forecasted? Just like there's the State of Grant Seeking Survey, there are countless reports that are talking about the state of giving. So looking at individual giving, sometimes those then help us understand family foundations. There's lots of private philanthropy reports and summaries that are put out that are helping us to understand where are things headed. Now, just because I've got a unique sense of humor sometimes as it relates to grants, pretend that you can see me picking the magic 8-ball up off my desk. It's right here behind me. No, it is not the one I had as a child. My, how I wish I kept some of those cool, now vintage toys. Mine's a knockoff from a few years ago, but I get it. Sometimes when you're trying to assess the upcoming landscape and think about, well, what do I want to predict for how I might increase my funding, or how I might increase the budget size we have, I might have to ask the magic 8-ball. Likelihood? Is it decidedly so? Uncertain? What's happened? You're in good company. We're all in that same space sometimes. But more than anything, let's put our magic 8-ball down, and instead, let's look at what has worked for you. You as a tribal organization, for the metrics that you were just talking about earlier when you were looking at your dashboard. What are your methods, your approaches to grant seeking that have been successful before? How can you build on them to make things successful again? Yes, I believe that we always can learn something from failure, but I don't want to dwell on failure. And in the case of grants, that's going to be our rejections. There's so much that goes into a grant rejection that we cannot control. So what I want to focus on
is what is your methodology? What is your approach? What is your way of implementing grant seeking best practices that brings about your success? That is your unique proven method. It probably has some unique organizational culture items to it, how you as a group of members in your tribal organization and employees, how you work together, that's different than one of your peers on the line. It's just a little bit different because you as people and your experiences are slightly different. So how can you build upon and replicate your success from the past? Yes, yes, yes. We will always ask for feedback and learn from our grant rejections. But I care more about the success you have and, frankly, the feedback you get from grant makers, asking them for feedback when you get an award. What did you learn? What did they like? So here, one last why for yes, N for no type question in the chat box. How many of you are regularly asking for your feedback when you get a grant award? I didn't ask about rejections. How many of you are regularly asking for feedback when you get a grant award? Y for yes, N for no, M for maybe, sometimes, sort of, if I remember. Oh, yay, Mary, that makes me so happy. You recently started? Fantastic. Awesome. Just like when you ask for feedback about what's been denied, you won't always get feedback when you ask about what just got awarded. But your likelihood of getting feedback is much higher from those who have awarded you funding because, well, they're fans. They said yes. They liked what you put forward, that you got a top score or a near top score. They are actually more likely to give you that feedback. And then what do? Digest the feedback and say, how do we replicate that again? That was your proven method for getting to success. How do we do it again? So this goal setting related to our grant seeking metrics, it might feel really individual. Like this is our thing as a grant seeker, a grant writer, a grant professional that we need to worry about. And on some level, we're the ones spearheading the conversation, but it really is about the organization as a whole and what metrics are important, not just to you, but to others to see that will help make decisions, that will help people understand how and why you're asking for their time and why they should prioritize it. As you set those goals and agree on them, regardless of what the dashboard may or may not include, what it may or may not look like, from there you can build a plan. And by that, I mean your grant calendar that you probably have already created with your deadlines. Now you can think about if our metrics that we're focused on are related to new relationships, wow, I better make sure that I have grant maker relationship time set aside maybe once a month, maybe every 2 weeks. What you put on your calendar, what you put on your grant plan, what you put in your grant strategy should reflect the metrics that you choose to select for your upcoming goal. What you choose to make it look like, again, as basic as it needs to be. I am, as I had mentioned before, a fan of Excel, of Google Sheets, but folks sometimes get a little lost when they're looking at the different Excel sheets we create as grant professionals, so I would keep it as simple as possible. If you can have a quick visual as well for people who don't love Excel sheets quite as much as maybe you do. So a quick automatic dashboard, something that's a visual, a pie chart, a bar graph, anything like that that is going to help those who are looking at it digest the information in a variety of ways. I do strongly encourage that because we want our colleagues to understand what are the metrics that we've set for success, not just, well, we're trying to secure $5 million in grant awards this year, or not just, air quotes, we're trying to secure $1 million in grant awards this year. The number's not important. The number is what the number is for your organization, but we want them to think about their role in achieving these metrics. You cannot do it by yourself. Well, you might say you could do it by yourself. You might feel like sometimes you have to do it by yourself, but the reality is to achieve the metrics that we've been talking about, to see them improve, to see the numbers get bigger and stronger, we need others in our organization. I have talked about grant teams before, and I'm sorry, I have to do it again. I can't not if it is the conversation about metrics and strategy. To try and increase your grant revenue, to try and increase your award percentage, or to increase your number of collaborative grant applications, or to enhance the percent of budget that has been met. It's going to take others in the organization. If you try to do it all by yourself, well, I think you'll be looking at the burnout issue that so many grant professionals have talked about, and the surveys through the Grant Professionals Association journal articles have proven is really a problem within folks who are doing this work. We don't want that. So I want to return to the definition of a grant team, but I want to think about it from the perspective of our metrics. Are talking about these metrics and strategy today. So if the grant team is a group of colleagues that have a stake in creating competitive grant applications, well, oh, right, we do need folks to help us do that. And if they're engaged in helping to provide information and review and feedback and maybe even some facilitation around collaborative grant applications, we should therefore share some of the joy and the celebration with these colleagues as we achieve the metrics. Grant work is slow work. We wait a really long time to hear about most of our applications. So if your colleagues are actively engaged in providing information for your applications, whether it's something formal or informal, whether they're meeting you on Zoom or Teams or in person, whether they're meeting you to talk about just one application or they're meeting to talk about 10 applications in a year, I want you to think about your dream team, the folks who are helping with your grant applications. Your dream team is probably celebrating together when? Probably when you get a grant award. In fact, could you let me know in the chat box, what is it that your organization does to celebrate success with grants? What is it that you do to celebrate when you get a grant award, or maybe you are celebrating more than grant awards, but we'll say at least with grant awards. What is it that you are doing as a team when you get a new grant award? What is it that you are doing to celebrate? Would love to hear in the chat box. What is it that you do to celebrate now? The reason I have all these different roles laid out here on this dream team slide is because all of these folks who contributed to your application are in the moment super excited to hear about the award, and they probably feel excited and proud that even if it wasn't the main character level energy that they brought to the application, they contributed something meaningful, and wow, it created something great as a result. You know what's actually even better than celebrating at the time of the award? Celebrating on an ongoing basis when small things are achieved. The little things that lead to the overall big stuff like the awards. So in some ways, the superhero image on the right-hand side, all our different Marvel characters, well, we don't want to only think about the big superhero finishes that we're celebrating. It's all the little stuff that leads up to it that we want to celebrate, because it's the little things It's thinking about our different indicators. Well, let's see, if we have new grant maker relationships, I might help form some colleagues might help form some. Those outreach conversations we have at a conference or over email, right? Having people help with these smaller activities along the way, the act of getting financial reports turned in not just on the day of the deadline, but a day or 2 or 5 days before, I would say that those are some superhero skills that we're seeing. Those actions lead to a stronger grant strategy. Those actions lead to an improvement in your grant metrics. All right, well, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation in the chat box about what you're doing to celebrate your grant awards, which perhaps means I have to issue a different challenge. It's not only about picking your one new metric that you want to track this upcoming year. Maybe part 2 of the challenge is to think about what will be your ongoing celebration method as a team when something good happens related to grants. Some of you have seen me show, when my webcam is working properly, my little yellow dingy bell sits right here on the desk. Comes out on Zoom calls, team calls, all the time for small things. It also happens to make an appearance as a bell emoji in chat channels and in emails. And I knew I was on to something when I started getting it back from client organizations in emails unsolicited. I didn't say anything and they were putting the bell in email as an indication of success, celebration, celebrating the little wins. I thought, okay, we're on to something. That's a positive. It can be whatever you need it to be, but I do encourage you to consider and find and agree on what is it you as an organization, what is it you as a grant team, strategy team, a fundraising team, whatever label, will do to celebrate along the way while you're starting to pay attention to these metrics. The more you can make this work visible, maybe now on your calendar, you even have grant metric review, grant dashboard review, grant dashboard updating. All and any of those are welcome on grant calendars. I told you what I have to do tomorrow. It's the first Friday that I have had the chance to sit down in the month, right? First of the month was over the weekend, so nope, wasn't the Friday before. I've got to wait till the month closes. Today's the first Friday, or not today, it's not Friday. Tomorrow is Friday. Tomorrow morning, first Friday of the new month, I sit down, I make sure we have all the metrics closed out and recorded. And that's a calendar commitment to me. If it's on my calendar, I promise you, it is going to happen. So I encourage you to think about where and how you'll put the commitment to these metrics in a spot that is visible not just to you, but to the rest of the grant team. I get it. Not everyone gets as excited about grant metrics as I might. You would think I had extra coffee today for how excited I get about it. No, I didn't. Just my normal 1 cup this morning at 5:30. But I just love talking about grant metrics. I'm curious if you're willing to share in the chat, certainly not required, but if you're willing to share what is the one metric of all the different metrics we talked about, what is the one you are most excited to start tracking and sharing with your colleagues? If you're willing to share, I would love to hear. Again, no pressure that you have to, but I would love to hear if you're willing to share. You have been fantastic participating in the chat box. I know I warned you in advance it was going to be a little different. I was asking for a lot more interaction than I normally would. But I appreciate you so much for being engaged. So I knew when I was ready to move on to the next metric. But if you have any questions now, I'm absolutely here, ready to answer. If you think of a question, it comes up for you when you go to build a dashboard or after you talk to your colleagues about one of the metrics, you can email me at any time. Absolutely happy to answer later. But I want to say thank you for how engaged you were in the chat box for me today. I can't wait to hear about what you've built for your dashboards and see how that helps you as you work to increase your grant support and the impact it's creating in your tribal communities. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation, Diane. If everybody in here enjoyed it, which I know you guys did, please take a moment or two to complete that feedback survey that I've linked for you in the chat. Just takes about 2 minutes to complete, lets us at the Native Learning Center know what's working well, what we can improve upon, and we do share that feedback with our instructors. You can be as candid as you would like. It is an anonymous survey. We hope you can join us for our next webinar. It is actually going to be a series that starts next week on Tuesday. This will be Understanding the Emergency Operations Center and Navigating Through a Crisis. That's going to be presented by Dr. William R. Latchford. And if you want to watch the recording of this or our other webinars, we do have a Cathedra Webinars archive located on our YouTube channel. That link is in the shared notes, and I'm actually going to copy and paste that into the chat right now for easy access. Feel free to share them with your friends, your colleagues, your family, anybody who you think would benefit from the material. And please join us for our upcoming training events. You can see them posted on our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. If you are a podcast fan, we have an in-house produced podcast, the Hope I Think a Native American podcast. You can listen to that wherever you listen to your podcasts. Or if you prefer to watch the interviews with our special guests, we have those posted to our YouTube channel as well. All right, folks, that does kind of bring us to the end of today's webinar. I don't see anybody typing any questions for Diane in the chat, so I will go ahead and close us out. But I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day, have a fantastic weekend, and we hope to connect with you again really soon. We appreciate your time, guys. Take care.